Hi, my name's Keith Watson. For those who don't know about me, I am a psychic medium. I've been working in this profession for the last 20 years. I'm the author of a book called The Message, Two Voices. And if people want to check me out, I do have a website, psychickeith.com. I've been getting information which started with me last Friday evening, a week ago. At first I tried to ignore it, which is how I normally operate, but it's become so strong that I just felt it was important to get the information that I do have out there in the public. So far we have very little or nothing to go on, and if we just treat what I have as another line of inquiry, well, if it's wrong, I'll apologise before we start, but if it's right, it could potentially or definitely find the plane, but potentially find survivors. I'm not going to sit here and say everyone on that plane has died, because while ever there is hope, you've got to give it a chance. And I can't honestly say everyone on that plane is dead. I do not know. To explain the information that I do have, last Friday evening, as most things with me, it started with effectively a dream. The dream didn't make a lot of sense. It was as if I was in a darkened room with lots of voices speaking. Different nationalities, but predominantly I was hearing Chinese voices. At first I assumed that I was in a darkened room, but what it actually could be, without trying to make it fit, is it could be a lot of people in the dark at night. Saturday morning I totally ignored this. I thought, what a weird dream. Later on, somebody texted me a question about the missing flight, and only then did I sort of let the cogs in my head turn towards it. Now people might say, well, how can I find a plane when all the authorities out there don't have a clue? Well, it's really quite simple. When dealing with energy, and sometimes it can be living energy, not just spiritual energy, when a person or an element is distressed, their energy spikes. So imagine 200 people in that state, and that energy spike, then it becomes a radio signal, and anyone that's sensitive to those signals should pick it up. What they then translate from that information, that's where it gets a little more tricky. I've had people talk to me, even though I don't want to hear about everything from aliens to them being locked in a hangar somewhere, being fed caviar and champagne to keep them quiet. Well, obviously, all that is nonsensical. But just take it step by step. Some of the information I'm going to give you may not make a lot of sense or logic, but I'm not an aeroplane engineer, and I can only work with what I have. That's for the guys out there to try and make some sense of. I meditated and tried to focus on the plane and asked a series of questions. The first question being, what happened? And I got a simple one-word reply, and that was magnets. Now it means absolutely nothing to me. My mind ran a little bit wild, and this is sheer speculation, but I thought of electromagnetic pulses, and where that would come from, I haven't a clue, but the effect it would have on a plane is that it would disable all the electronics and disable anything electrical on that plane. And my feeling is that the plane is flying blind. Everything's down. The other problem is that something has also affected the air pressure in not just the flight deck, but also the cabin. And there is a lack of oxygen. One of the problems I've had this week is constant headaches and nausea every time I've focused on the plane. And I believe this is a state that some, if not all, of the cabin and crew were going through. And I'm pretty sure that at some point the pilots passed out, and maybe certain members of the cabin and crew passed out. But they're not unconscious all the time. It's coming in and out of consciousness. The plane tried to land. They had an idea of a place that they wanted to head towards. But the reason the plane is so all over the place, for want of a better word, is the fact that they are flying blind. And in between trying to stay conscious and passing out, they missed the point where they wanted to land. And they've headed out over the ocean. And that effectively they've flown until they've run out of fuel. I have been for a week, and I've called this 3 dots and a comma. And it is an area of land that I keep being shown in my mind's eye. And what I want you to picture is this. Imagine a clock face. And you've got 1 dot at 10 to the hour, 1 dot at 20 to the hour, and 1 dot at 1/4 the hour. And then add that between the midday and 1/4, a comma. And you've got 4 pieces of land, not big enough to be called islands. They're more like big rocks. But I believe that I'm estimating that at least one of these dots could be a few miles in area and able to sustain life. But all the time, every time, I see the 3 dots and a comma. This is a geographical point and not something that's moving. And I'm convinced that even though it's not on all the maps, there are people who are familiar with the terrain and the area who will know exactly what I'm talking about and will know where to look. I believe that this is really, really fundamental in finding the body of the plane and potentially anyone that may still be alive. I also was given 3 numbers. Originally, I had the number 49. Someone has told me that 49 represented the depth in cubic meters of the water where the plane was last pinged, if you like. I don't know whether this is true or not, but it's what I've been told. Further along the way, I have 2 separate areas. One is 3,200. I don't know whether this is the depth of the water in cubic meters or whether this is a distance, but it is relevant. And I would ask that anyone that is familiar with the area and who understands the ocean would look for areas with that specific depth or within a region of that depth. But what I believe is that the plane hasn't sunk that far down. I get the feeling of the plane being in a basin or on a plate that is possibly no more than 120 metres below the surface. I don't believe the plane sunk immediately. I do believe that it rested on the surface of the water for a small amount of time. But I do believe that there is some problem with the tail of the plane that ultimately it may have broken away. Then there are other factors that have been very strong in my mind. Predominantly, I kept seeing a lot of action at the rear of the plane. At first I put it down to being some sort of blockage, but then the more I focus on it, the more I see people gathering at the rear of the plane. Now, it's a guess, but what if the front of the plane, the doors wouldn't open, but at the rear of the plane they would, and that was a way of getting off? It's a guess, but it's all I could put it down to. Then I got lots of trivia, for want of a better word. When I work, I don't work on the principle of has somebody got a Jim or a Jane in the room. When spirits come through to me, they often come through with groups of names. I can sometimes have as many as a dozen people all from the same family, all giving me names and places where they're from. I had the name originally Rob. Now, this could be 2 things, because I was looking for someone connected to the plane to speak to with regard to this matter, and there's a gentleman over in Brisbane called Rob Halling who very kindly offered to speak to me because his business associate had been on board, and I assumed that was the Rob I'd had in my head. He was the point of contact. But he explained that there was somebody on board called Rob Lawton. Now this was before any of the names had been given out as to who was on board. Now it's openly in the media, so anyone can say, well, I knew that, but be rest assured I didn't. And I said I would be happier if I knew who Kath and who David was. And I found later that, but I did stress that I didn't feel that David was on board. And I found out later that Kath was Rob Lawton's wife and she was with him. And his brother is David, who's been in the news quite frequently. Another thing I saw, I kept seeing a hostess nursing a small child. This child would be Chinese, 3-4 years old. I also had an idea that the hostess herself might be of Chinese origin. I am still not able to confirm this, but when all I got around this hostess was the name Peggy. And I was led to believe that one of the hair hostesses on board, her mother, was called Peggy. Since then, somebody has said that this isn't so. But the name is still very, very relevant to a parent or a relation of someone that was on the plane. Other little things, I kept seeing someone, I couldn't see their face, but they either had a tattoo or a crescent-shaped birthmark on the right shoulder. This might resonate with someone. Other things, I kept seeing, strangely, a Tom and Jerry cartoon playing. And whether this was being shown on the TV screens when everything went off, or whether somebody was watching it through a laptop or a tablet, which is unlikely, I don't know. It might bear no relevance and just be my imagination, but it did feel very, very pertinent. There are lots of other things that now are jumping in and out of my mind, but yeah, I have to stop just for a second there. I know we can pause. What I'm wanting to get from this, quite simply, is obviously to find the plane. I am all but certain that the area of land that I'm describing is an area where the plane or potential survivors can be found. If anyone out there who has family on the plane is prepared to talk to me, either by telephone or preferably Skype so I can see that person, then basically by linking into them I can only get more clearer information, which can only then make the search easier. Also, it is important that this information get to the authorities and people that may know exactly where this body of land is. And I think specifically I'm heading towards the Australian government. I actually feel the Americans could help as well. They seem to have more knowledge about these things than anyone. Well, the other point that sticks with me, I've said from day one that the plane travelled in a southwesterly direction and not overland. So obviously that's proved to be right. There's also a sense that one of the things that I haven't yet mentioned, it stuck in my head for 2 days, that I kept getting Mauritius as being very, very heavily linked. And I haven't gone away from that, but I actually wondered if this cluster of islands could be in that sort of area and a little bit further away from, say, Australia. But somebody out there must know what this cluster is. Just to have a look, that's all I'm asking. It's just another line of inquiry. Just because it's come from a source that people may see as being questionable, great, I accept that. But if I'm right, it could save a lot of time and a lot of lives. Thank you very much for your time on that. Thank you.